Okay, so we are now going to change gears a bit and do something quite different from listening to papers, because one of the features that we've included in this Social Security meeting for a number of years now is to have a panel discussion on one of the core issues that relates to thinking about the long-term viability and sustainability of Social Security and disability systems in developed countries. And those of you who are veterans of this meeting for a number of years know that we've talked about fertility issues, about mortality forecasting, about disability forecasting, about productivity, and how to think about the potential distribution of wages going forward. And of course, those of you who are from the US know that we are facing a set of projections at the moment. If you follow the Social Security trustees reports that suggest that the OASDI funds will be running out the trust funds sometime in the early 2030s. The exact year depends on some of the projection details. And consequently, thinking about the building blocks for those projections becomes quite relevant in trying to loop back to what might policy responses be and how would the political economy of these programs evolve. And when we've got the kind of expertise that we have in the room today, it's just a great thing for us to be able to pick one of these topics and discuss it. So this year we agreed that the topic would be essentially the future of employment, thinking about the number of employed workers or scaling that by population, thinking about the employment population ratio going forward. We picked this number 6 or 7 months ago, and Manasi and I were back and forth on what would be reasonable here. We pulled in some of our friends from the Social Security Administration. Those of the labor economists here will know that we actually have seen some recent numbers that have just come out from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that the labor force participation rate for the 16 plus population is now about 62.6%, which is taking us back to pre-pandemic levels in the US. For the 25 to 54-year-old population, I think it's about 83.5%. That's back to 2007 levels. So there have been some interesting recent data on what's happening with regard to labor force participation and total employment levels. So what we're going to do today is to have a panel with 4 panelists. The first person is, and due to some congestion and weather issues yesterday and getting from Washington to Boston, we will have one of our panelists in person here, and that will be Nicole Maestas, who has been a co-author on one of the papers already this morning, and of course leads the NBER's Retirement and Disability Research Center, which is supported by SSA. Karen Glenn, who is the Deputy Chief Actuary at SSA, is going to lead off the presentation today, and she'll actually say a bit about, and Tricia, we might actually tee up Karen if we can get her on the screen. She will actually describe a bit the long-term forecasting that SSA does at the moment. We'll then move on to the second presentation, will be by Julie Topoleski, who is from the Congressional Budget Office, leads their long-term modeling, in particular some of the work that CBO does around the Social Security system. And we thought it'd be very useful to get the perspective from both SSA and CBO on how they have approached some of these issues. And I hope that we'll get a little bit of refinement on how to think about the differences where there are some between the forecasts they make. And along the way, I hope we'll be getting some open research questions that a group like this can think about taking out and going forward with. Then Nicole will be our third speaker. She'll come to the podium here and give us an in-person presentation. And finally, Steve Goss, who's the chief actuary of SSA, will be batting cleanup and offering some comments on these issues, and then we'll open up to broad discussion. So I think without further ado, Karen, we're delighted that you're on the screen with us and we see your slides, and take it away.
Great. All right. Hopefully you can hear me as well. Yes?
Loud and clear.
Excellent. All right. Good morning, everyone. We are really glad to be here today to get the expertise of the folks in the room. As Jim said, this is one of the highlights for us every year, getting to present these issues that we're facing every day. So I am going to kick it off, kind of set the stage for the really good panelists we've got following me. So I'm going to lead off with why employment matters and just some of the factors we look at related to employment. So, number one, why does employment matter for Social Security projections? First order, obviously, higher employment to population ratio leads to more workers who are making payroll tax contributions, and therefore more payroll tax revenue coming into the system. Second order, over time, those same workers mean that more workers get benefits. So, or more total years of work per worker. And putting that all together, that means an increase in benefit payments. Same things go the other way. Lower epop means things in the other direction. The net effect of higher epop tends to be a positive effect on the financial status of the trust funds, because the increase in payroll tax revenue happens before we get the increase in benefit payments. So factors in our model. I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail. If you're interested, you can see at the bottom, we've got a link to a detailed study our office puts out on this by Polina Vlasenko and Judith Abuaji. Factors in our model include age, sex, marital status, the presence of children under age 6, the state of the economy, disability prevalence, educational attainment, and a couple of factors that affect the timing of the retirement decision. So the Social Security benefit replacement rate, Social Security retirement earnings test, cohort effects. We do have in our model lagged cohort effects for those ages 75 and older, because those patterns haven't really been reflected in the historical data as well as we would like. So we built that in as well. And we do have a time trend for some of the younger groups. So where are we? This graph shows where we were for the ratio of employment to population historically and through the 75-year projection that we do for Social Security in both the 2022 and the 2023 Trustees Report. 2023 Trustees Report is the most recent. That came out in April. One thing to note is that we set these assumptions back in December 2022. So some of the things we were expecting over the near term didn't really pan out. You can see that we were expecting a slowdown in growth in 2023. Obviously, as Jim mentioned at the beginning, that hasn't really panned out. So the peril of making any projections at a point in time. Bottom line, we are expecting these ratios to return to the peak level of around 2019 in the future, gradually drift up very slowly over time. And we are expecting the gap between men and women to remain about where it is now. So zooming in a little bit more on the nearer term, do we think the labor market has fully recovered from COVID and the ensuing recession? We've got labor force participation rates on the left here, employment rates on the right. And note that our LFPRs are all age adjusted to the 2011 population. So this may look a little bit different than the gross rates many of you are working with. But what do we note from this graph? Basically, both rates, employment and LFPRs, have recovered to the pre-recession level for women, not as much for men. Although this recent data we've just gotten looks like things are looking up for men as well. But definitely everything's looking a little bit better for women. One other thing that we just think this is pretty interesting. This graph looks at the ratio of E to pop versus the quits rate. The E to pop is the blue line here. It's exactly what you've seen on the other graph. And the dashed red line is the quits rate. You can see that since about 2001, until we hit the pandemic period, these two lines followed each other very closely. In the pandemic and following, the relationship kind of blew up. So what does this mean? Obviously, these elevated quits rates mean that there's a tight labor market. People are changing jobs and it's easy for them to do so. But will this relationship hold in the future, or has it just changed going forward? So something we're thinking about. This is a new graph we put together recently, and this was actually done by Mike Stevens in our office, who's one of our disability experts. There's a lot here, so let me orient you a little bit. The top graph is focusing on employment data for those who are self-identifying as disabled. And note again, this is self-identification. This is from the CPS. So it's not really the same definition as we've got in the DI program, but obviously there's a lot of correlation there. So in that disabled graph at the top, you can see the blue line that's pretty steady near the bottom. This is the percent of people who are self-identifying as disabled. And you can see that that's been really stable over time. The fluctuations we see in the gray and orange lines at the top, those are epop and LFPR again. Those are not explained by the changes in disability prevalence over time. So the one really interesting thing to note here is that since about the beginning of 2020, really right after the pandemic, employment of the disabled has been increasing quite a bit. And if you look at the bottom graph, which is the non-disabled, we're not really seeing those same patterns. So are there changes going on that are allowing these disabled folks or self-identified disabled folks to be able to work more? Seems like that's certainly a possibility. And I know some of the other presentations have talked about that some, but it's just really interesting to us to see these patterns going on recently. And my last slide here. Another thing we look at is employment of folks over age 65. So this breaks down epop, men on the left, women on the right, by age group. And you can see that since 1990, employment of those older folks has been steadily trending up. Obviously a little blip around the time of the pandemic and the recession, but seems to be going back up again. Will those patterns continue? Obviously, we are doing projections out 75 years, so considering whether those patterns will continue is very important to us. So with that, I am going to pass it over to Julie. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to be here on this panel today, and I'm sorry I'm not there in person. And about 8:30 last night, my flight was canceled, and so we pivoted, and now I'm on Zoom. And I know the topic today is the employment to population ratio, but we are actively working on thinking about our labor force participation rates, and so I thought I would take advantage of that, as that is on my mind, and sort of stick with that throughout my talk. Jim asked me to give a little bit of background on a sort of CBO and how we fit into this process. And so I'm going to try to go through the next, I think it's 3 slides pretty quickly, and talk first about sort of CBO's primary mandate, which is baseline budget projections, which are over a period of 10 years, and cost estimates, again, over a period of 10 years. Our baseline is done under the assumption that current laws governing spending and revenues generally remain unchanged. I will note that for Social Security, obviously under current law, benefits would not be fully payable after trust fund exhaustion. But for baseline purposes, we assume that benefits are paid as scheduled. CBO also does long-term projections. So each year we put out a 30-year long-term budget outlook. Our most recent one came out a couple of weeks ago. And we also do 75-year Social Security projections. And again, our most recent report came out just a couple of weeks ago. And just to note that our analysis is independent. So thinking about why that matters is that we have, I won't go through sort of how we think about our analysis, but it does mean that, one, we are independent. We have a different set of projections than do the trustees for their trustees report. And another note that the demographic and economic projections that CBO uses for its analysis are consistent with those that it uses for its baseline projections and for other purposes. So we spend a lot of time thinking about the first 10 years. We obviously extend those to 30 and then to 75 years. But the projections that we use within CBO are all consistent and all based on the same set of projections, which just sort of puts another level of constraints on it than when you're thinking about the Social Security system in isolation. And then just really quickly putting those pieces together. So just to sort of set the stage and look at what outlays and revenues look like. In our projections, revenues are roughly constant as a share of GDP. We have payroll taxes declining over time, but income taxes on benefits rising over time. So revenues are pretty stable, but outlays, as you can see, are growing as our population is aging, and we end up with a larger share of the population being of claiming age. Those outlays continue to grow. And just to put up a chart that'll be familiar to all of you, labor force participation rates, both historically from 1970 and then through our projection. And the overwhelming takeaway from this, of course, is that participation rates are downward sloping. That is largely attributable to aging. And I don't have a nice chart like Karen did, but we also, of course, think about the effect of aging on labor force participation. And if we run a hypothetical scenario where we assume that the population isn't aging, we end up at the end, this is after a 30-year projection, but in 2053 with a participation rate that is 3.4 percentage points higher than in our baseline projections. So very much like the chart that Karen just showed, we end up with a pretty flat chart there. And one final chart, this is sort of inspired by a Washington Post article a couple of weeks ago, shows the number of people in and out of the labor force by age group and year. So on the y-axis, we have age group, and then we have the number of people in millions on the x-axis. And what you can see over time, what's a really strong takeaway from this picture is the growing number of people over age 70. So in our projections, we do have some people 70 plus in the labor force. And actually in our models, because we assume all unemployment in the Social Security world, because we assume unemployment spills are all less than a year, those things are pretty equivalent. But you can really see the burden on the working population of supporting this older population. And just a couple of slides about how we project our labor force participation right now. So our projections are really based on a set of models by Stephanie Aronson and others. It's a cohort-based model that estimates participation rates within age, sex, education, and race subgroups. What that turns out to in our modeling is that we we project participation for 516 age, sex, race, and education groups. And actually, if you're interested in our projections, they're not quite available at this level of detail, but they are by age and sex available on our website. And just to note that each age, sex, race, education group is estimated as a system of equations where we constrain the cohort effects to be consistent. And as you might imagine, with 516 groups, that's a lot of stuff to keep track of. And because we use these projections for multiple purposes, not just to create our aggregate projections, but we also use that in our long-term Social Security microsimulation model, we end up having to apply a lot of judgment to do things like keep participation rates by age from crossing, so you don't end up with weird results in the micros, which you'll see that we're thinking about ways we can simplify this analysis. So each group equation has an age group specific fixed effect, a cohort fixed effect, an array of time varying covariates. And of course, because we're doing projections, we have to not only estimate, but then project each of those things. And as Karen alluded to, projecting cohort effects can be really tricky. And the results of the modeling are very sensitive to how you project those cohort effects. And one final note before I sort of turn it into a slide with some of the things that we're thinking about is CBO also uses this model to project potential labor force participation, because that's really what matters for our macro modeling. So that just adds another layer of complexity into thinking about this problem for us. And then a last slide. So as I said, we are revisiting how we project labor force participation. And I've listed here some of the questions that we are grappling with. So thinking about relationships between participation and age, sex, education, and immigration. Will those be similar? Are they similar to they were in the past? And how should we think about projecting those? How should we think about relationships between participation and changes to tax policy and transfer programs? So we know under current law at the end of 2025, the 2017 Tax Act, the individual tax cuts associated with that will be expiring. How do we think about the effect of that on participation, and how should we project that? We also think about the relationship between the data we're looking at and earnings from payrolls and survey measures, and are those going to be similar? Are those similar now to what they were in the past? We know the gig economy is growing. How should we think about that? And then finally, can a more parsimonious and tractable model than CBO's current one produce more accurate projections? And I would add to that, produce projections that we can explain. One of the nice things about being at CBO is our work is widely read, but our primary client and our audience is Congress. And so how can we explain what we're doing in a way that is understandable to them? And I'm sorry I'm not there in person to be able to sort of talk to some of you about some of these questions that we're having, but I hope that I've given you some things to think about, and I look forward to the conversation. And now I think I am handing over to Nicole.
Yep. Who is coming to the podium as you switch over. So this is great. Thank you, Julie. That was great.
Thank you.
So just to get us going, I am going to cover four. Nobody can hear me, right? Yeah. I'm going to cover, just try to briefly address four things. First of all, like, what do we know about the decline in the employment to population ratio so far, particularly for this period, 1999 through 2018. And then I'm going to talk a bit about population aging and what we know about its effects on the economy. Next, a bit on groups on the margin of labor force entry and exit, and in particular, that will be older workers and people with disabilities, to build on what Karen discussed. And then I'll finish with some things I'm worrying about. So what do we know about the decline in the employment to population ratio? I think like the best take on this comes from Catherine Abraham and Melissa Carney's work published in 2020. And so what they analyze is the reasons for the decline in the employment to population ratio from 1999 to 2018. So that was a 3.8 percentage point decline over that period. And they do this decomposition analysis where they separate the role of changes in the share of population in older ages from within age group changes in employment rates. And so the thing that I really want to highlight here is that if they assume they just hold all within group employment rates fixed at 1999 values and just let population age group shares change as they did, population aging can explain the entire 3.8 percentage point decline. Okay. Now, of course, there were other things happening, other offsetting effects, and in particular, there was a decline in employment among people 16 to 54. That was a 2.7 percentage point decline. There was an increase in employment among 55 plus. That accounted for 1.6 percentage points of the decline. And then there were these interesting interactions where a greater share of population was flowing into these higher employment rate groups, like the 55 plus group, right? So actually, one lingering last benefit of the baby boom, their sort of last contribution to faster employment growth before they head into the retirement age cohorts. So, on net, we get 3.8 percentage points. Now, their paper really digs into the decline in the employment to population ratio within age groups, in particular the 16 to 54 age group. And the major reasons they find, and so this is a survey across all the literature of across these various potential effects on the employment to population ratio, a focus on causal evidence here. And the biggest factor was adverse shifts in labor demand, they find. In particular, import competition, in particular, the China shock from Otter's work, but also industrial robots. That's from the Acemoglu and Restrepo work. Those were the biggest contributions. Much more modest contributions they find were the DI programs, and this isn't just SSDI, this is also the VA program, accounting for about a decline of 0.17 points in the of that 3.8 decline. Higher minimum wages, increased incarceration, those were smaller effects. And importantly, not important at all, were expansions in the social safety net. So SNAP, Medicaid, the EITC, Immigration similarly didn't matter much, and they also thought that lack of family leave was also not a factor. There were some things that, they thought needed more study. There just wasn't the evidence for them. One of them, quite, possibly an important one, is opioids and the impact of the opioid epidemic on employment. But also things like changing social norms and occupational licensing and the like. The one offsetting factor here was rising education. Okay, so this is one that in particular is attributed, is sort of part of the reason why we see this rise in employment among the 55 plus. Okay. So that's what we know so far about what's kind of happened, takes us almost to the eve of the pandemic. Let's talk about population aging. And so now I'm going to take like a really long view here. And what you're looking at, nothing fancy here. This is just the employment to population ratio downloaded directly from FRED, the Federal Reserve's data source. And so this is a graph from 1946 epop all the way through the present period. And the percents here on the y-axis are ranging from 50 to 65. So we're just really zooming in on the shape. And then these, the gray bars are, they will automatically and very nicely put the recession periods in gray for you. So you can really see, at a very, detailed monthly level, the cyclical fluctuation in the employment to population ratio over time. But what I think is super interesting about this long view is the shape, right? So you really see 1946, that's when the baby boom was just beginning to be born, right? And then, so you see a flat, flat epop. And then as the baby boom is starting to enter the workforce and fill out the workforce, epop is rising, it flattens out. About as they begin to retire, it starts declining in 2010. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a curve and I'm going to graph it on this exact same scale. Okay, so it's not going to have its own scale on the right hand side. We're going to use the same scale. What I'm going to plot is the percent of population ages 16 to 64. And this is just data. That's just the demographics here, the age structure of the US population. And you can see that it has this very similar shape. Now there's some really interesting departures where we had more population than we had employment. But the demographics really do shape what happens with epop here. And it takes a lot of positive news on labor demand to really offset some of these, this really important drag on the employment to population ratio. And, just looking ahead, well, what, the orange line here, what if, what's the projection for 2030 or 2060? It's this, right? So, does this mean epop is going to similarly kind of follow this downward trend over time? I don't know, but it is remarkable how in sync these two curves move. That's not surprising, of course. We do know that, from theory and now from evidence that population aging does impact the economy in important ways. It slows labor force growth. That's what you were seeing there. It also slows productivity growth, we find, in the US over a period of the last 3 decades. And those two factors together, absent offsetting effects on capital, lead to slower GDP growth. And that is a study that Kathleen Mullen, who's in the room here, and I did that just came out in AJ Macro finally after many years. We calculate there that there's been an annual loss in GDP of about 1/3 of a percentage point from the 1980s to 2010. We lost as much as maybe 1.2 percentage points off GDP in 2010 through 2020. And currently we're losing about 0.6. Okay, so that's about 1/3 due to the employment population ratio and 2/3 due to the productivity slowdowns. Now, when you talk about the productivity slowdowns, people automatically think about technology and these forces like capital deepening, where we have more capital per worker. Could technology make it easier for some people to work, older people, people with disabilities, and really anyone. And the evidence so far, in our study, we find very, very suggestive evidence that maybe there's been a little bit of a positive effect from capital deepening. But by and large, the evidence from Acemoglu and Restrepo finds that it's largely been about technology so far, robots in particular, has largely been about employment displacement more than productivity enhancement. Okay, so that's sort of the thing we need to switch going forward, is start getting more productivity gains, and maybe they're there and we just haven't found them yet, and we'll find them for the current period. But that's sort of where that literature stands on aging. Now, older workers, of course, this is similar to what what Karen showed a moment ago, is that what I'm plotting here is just employment to population within age groups. It's exactly the same thing, hopefully, that she showed. And you see that the red and the orange line are the older workers, where we've seen a rise in the employment rate. So while epop has been declining for the younger age groups, it certainly has been rising for about 30 years for the 55 plus group. And so what does the research say about that, and whether that's likely to continue? Well, so far the research concludes that there is substantial work capacity among older workers, and modest rates of decay in work capacity with age. The caveat, of course, is that is heterogeneity, right? And working longer, of course, is not a possibility for everyone, in particular people in very physically demanding jobs. And I think importantly, for thinking about, well, how much can older workers be part of the solution to the slowdown in employment due to population aging? Older workers are quite sensitive to working conditions. They value certain job attributes quite highly, in fact, more highly than than younger workers do. And what you're seeing here is another study with Kathleen Mullen, where we ran stated preference experiments in order to elicit valuations for different job amenities. And then we just, these are the valuations broken up by age group. So the orange bars that always jut out to the right here are your older workers who value schedule, the ability to set their own schedule, more so than the younger workers. They value moderate physical activity as opposed to heavy work, sitting as opposed to heavy work. And I've got a whole list here. These are valuations as a percent of the wage that we were able to back out from this design. The bottom line is, about 38% will tell you that, yeah, I'd be interested in coming back into the labor force for the right opportunity. Well, this is what the right opportunity is about here. And employers have to be willing to offer positions that can offer these kinds of amenities, if you will. Now, the rise in disability employment is something that I just think is absolutely remarkable, since the narrative here was, only a decline in employment among people with disabilities for decades. But as you can see in this graph, what you're looking at is the blue line is people without a work disability, and there have been some question changes, as you heard earlier in the CPS that are rather unfortunately timed. But for what you're seeing in red is the employment to population ratio for people with work disabilities running back to 1988. And so we do get this level up rating in, so you're seeing there's the red line, and then it shifts kind of to a pink line for the same periods. So that the CPS question was revised to include temporary disabilities. So there is this like level upshift. But you can see these curves all start. So the epop for people with disabilities really does start turning around, and it's true in absolute terms and relative terms. So what I've done here on the left is we're zooming in on the around the epop on the other graph for people with disabilities, and you can see there's a clear upward pattern in employment here across both measures. And it is also on the right an increase in the employment rate relative to the blue line, which is the people for the employment rate for people without disabilities as a group. Okay, now this turnaround, so we have this like turnaround among older workers in employment. Now we have a turnaround in disability in employment among people with disabilities coming a decade later. I was very worried that the pandemic would just erase all of those gains. Fortunately, that has not been the case. And this is work with Ari Naaman, who's here in the room. And what you see here, so what we've done is this is again just like the data, what the data say, comparing relative employment for people with disabilities and without. And the top figure is normalized to the first quarter of 2019. So we set both groups to their employment rate in that quarter. And you can see what's really quite remarkable here is that people with disabilities didn't lose any more employment in relative terms than did the general population of people without disabilities. And their recovery has been on pace, and then it has even pulled ahead. And if you break this apart into, in fact, I think you actually can't see my bottom pictures here. Anyway, what the bottom pictures would show you, if you could see them, are that this gain is strongest and concentrated among occupations that are teleworkable. Okay, so what this is telling us is that there's something about the willingness of employers to accommodate people with disabilities that has to be, driving this great success in the labor market coming out of the pandemic. And lastly, on this point, before I tell you what I'm worrying about, and I promise I'll stop, there has been also a really interesting increase in the number and the percent of people who are exiting SSDI, the great absorbing state. It turns out that people have been leaving SSDI. Those rates have, beginning in about 2013, have increased quite substantially. So what you're seeing here, I'm measuring percents. Now, people who exit SSDI is only 0.5%, roughly, right? So we're not talking about a large group, but this very sustained trend in both, number and percent is very interesting. And then if you go look and see, well, who's having their benefits withheld because of work effort while on SSDI, well, that too has been going up at about the same rate. Okay, so I guess what my takeaway here is that something really interesting is happening in the labor market that is making it easier for people with disabilities to work. And it's not just that the DI program became less generous, because of course, these are folks who are already in the DI program, and even they are being kind of pulled out of the program and back into work. Okay, so two things I'm thinking about, so Karen had a disability incidence graph that was relatively flat. And, when I zoom in here, I see maybe a slight increase in the percent of people self-identifying as having a disability over time. You don't see it as much on, these are the 3 different questions that you get once the CPS redesign. Those are the curves here. And, maybe, it varies a little bit across the measures, but, there is this, if you look at the orange line there that shows a post-COVID uptick. When you decompose that, you do find that it is driven by people with difficulties concentrating, which is a very common long COVID complaint. And so, I can't say what's going to happen here, but I think it is something to watch. And there is a, kind of a longer term trend that we're seeing slightly more and more people reporting disability. And I would say this, this is all CPS, but, Angus Deaton and Case have some very interesting data where they kind of look at the health and pain reporting of cohorts as they're, it's not just in middle age that people have more pain, but all the younger cohorts that are coming along behind are reporting pain at higher rates. So something is going on here that has me quite worried. And then lastly, I wanted to say a word about the employment to population rate by gender, which brings me to caregiving. So this is just, again, the same picture for men and for women. And, there was a decline among women, just like a decline among men since 2000, after a period of very strong growth. And many of us thought that this trend would continue, but it didn't. This is what's happening by gender. And then you have juxtaposed against that rising need for long-term care. An aging population, of course, creates a need for more long-term care of elders. And, over half of all long-term care is informally provided by family and friends. And nearly 70% of people over 65 will require some assistance with basic functions at some point. So, this is kind of the coming storm population-wise. As the baby boom has not yet fully exited the labor force, right? So, I mean, it's just going to grow in terms of caregiving need. Now, we know from the research evidence that caregiving reduces work But Yulia Truskanovsky and I got to look at the life cycle earnings and employment patterns of caregivers over their whole life cycle in order to really kind of begin to understand, when do these impacts arise and how do employment earnings change at the start of caregiving, or are they changing, well before the start of caregiving? And so the dark red lines, these figures are just a little on the small side, and I apologize for that. But the dark red line is the employment and earnings of caregivers. You've got women and women's earnings, women's employment here. Whereas the dashed line is a matched control group. And if you can see there, you can't really see, there's some population averages in the background that just aren't showing up. But for women, you see very sharp drops around time zero, which is the start of caregiving, drops in earnings, drops in employment. And so, our takeaway here is that, and caregiving, of course, is not randomly assigned, and we've done as much as you can to get a very well matched. And you can see, actually, going back 15 years, these groups are actually very well matched on earnings and employment. There's more about that in the paper, but there is a very discrete, notable disruption in earnings and employment for women when caregiving begins. But for men, these disruptions in earnings and employment start much, much earlier. And our thinking here is that it does appear like women will leave work to take on caregiving if they have to. The men take on caregiving when they're already out of work. Okay. And so, epop's been declining. And so there've been some men out of work. Maybe we're, about 40% of caregivers are men. But I think these very different patterns of life cycle earnings and employment for men and women kind of just, they shed light on, they draw attention to just how complicated this is and raise important questions about, what are we going to do here and what will the policy solutions be? So with that, I'll stop.
Okay, so Steve, I think we have about 10 minutes left until we really do have to adjourn to lunch with this group. So I'm going to turn back to you to see if you have any kind of remarks, reactions to what we've just heard in the three presentations. And then if we have time, we'll open up for a few Q&A from around the room.
Jim, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, we're good.
Yeah, Jim, I actually had a presentation as the other three did. And I see we don't have much time left, but so let me try to run through this quickly. First of all, the thinking on this really emanated from back discussion with you, Jim, back some time ago about concerns about the changing age distribution of the population, pressures that's going to put on everything, and the possibility that with this changing age distribution, employers will, as we have seen in the case of people with limitations from some level of disability, might become more open to being more accommodating, not only for people with limitations through disability, but people who are older or people with limitations in many other ways. Will we have an increased demand for labor as we have a big shift in our population? Here you see the often looked at age dependency ratio, indicating the tremendous increase in the number 65 and over compared to 2064. Ergo, the standard population at 20 to 64 that we depend on is shrinking relative to the overall adult population over time. And what are we going to do about that in terms of maintaining an adequate number of people employed? So next slide, please. We see another way of looking at essentially the same thing. Thank you, Karen, for showing the slides. I'm having computer trouble, unfortunately, just like Julie had airline trouble. So on this one, this slide also deals with just the adult population and shows you, going all the way back to 1940, what the trends have been for the 25 to 44, 45 to 64, 65 to 84, and then the even higher age. And you can see some very interesting swings. The main thing, of course, is that by the time we get out to 2030, we will have had the baby boom shifting entirely out of working age population, replaced by lower birth rate generations, having this massive shift in our age of dependency ratio. That is going to be a big change for us. So the next slide, we see, looking at employment rates for these are employment and population ratios, basically for different age groups by sex. What has happened from 1970 out through 2010, and what we're anticipating going further out to 2030 and 2050. And what's remarkable here is the drop-off in the male rates after 1970, and the dramatic increase for women, especially up to age 55, between 1970 and 1990. Dramatic shift that went on. So men have really fallen off in their employment rates, not worried about labor force participation because unemployment rates can be anywhere. So we look for where the money is. That's actual employment. And we can see that men have dropped off a fair amount, but women have really pulled up and have made a big difference. So on the next slide, you can see that interesting little graph here. The orange line here indicates the number of OESDI covered workers, roughly employment, as a percentage of the total population, all ages. And this is fascinating because between 1970 and 1990, this jumped way up. Well, it jumped up for two reasons. One is, as we saw, women up to age 55 had a dramatic increase in their employment, whereas the population under 20, because of lower birth rates through after 1965, the population under 20 dropped, actually literally dropped between 1970 and 1990. So therefore, the number of covered workers per total population, all ages, actually went up. And our projection is that even after 2010, it's going to basically stay up in that territory. The bad news, though, is the projected number of covered workers in the population relative to our beneficiaries for Social Security. And that's a very, very different story there, obviously, because of the aging and where the concentration of our beneficiaries are. One thing to note is that you'll say, why would the big jump up in workers to total population that we have a drop down in workers per beneficiaries? Part of that was actually the maturation of the DI program between 1970 and 1990. It was a new program in 1957. It didn't actually start allowing people to get disability under age 50 until 1961. So there was a maturation process. Since then, it's been all about the population dynamics that have been going on, that have, of course, are long known problems with population dynamics. So the next slide. Question is, what can we do about this? So what if we were to posit that the male rates that dropped off significantly after 1970, what if we were to imagine all the male rates would go back up to where they were in 1970 and not have the drop off? That helps a little bit. It certainly helps in terms of the level of the overall workforce number of workers per total population. That kicks it up a little bit even further. But for our workers per beneficiary, it helps proportionally about the same, but really not much. It's not the answer to getting to where we would like to be if we were hoping that employment can be a major factor in financing Social Security into the future. It's just not enough. We would need an awful lot more increase in employment beyond just men getting back to where they were in 1970. So next slide. We can see here what we would need, and now we have the 16 and over men and women on the right-hand side. You can see the drop in men and the increase in women. We'd have to have an increase in these levels overall by about 1/3 from where we're projecting them to be in order for this to be a major factor in adequate financing of Social Security and getting us back to a level of employment to number of beneficiaries in the population. That simply does not look plausible. So the next slide, please. Just a little wrap up here. So the increasing population, it is definitely going to increase the demand for goods and services, and thus demand for workers in the future. We're seeing that in the current type labor markets, which might be cyclic. But on the other hand, we know that in the future, we're going to have this continued change towards a greater and greater share of the population over 65, of course, partly balanced by a lesser population under 20. So will there continue to be a pressure, as we saw both in the quits rate and in the tendency towards more and more people with identified disabilities to be in the labor force? Is this a harbinger of things to come where employers are going to continue to modify the nature of work, whether they want to or not, and therefore employ more people than we might expect by simply extrapolating participation rates and employment rates by age into the future? So question is, will there be increases in births and immigration due to future national policy. I think it was Nicole who mentioned, how about, childcare? I was actually put in the last president's budget. These are possibilities that could really help, but that would have a real effect on the changing age distribution of the population. Immigration is certainly something that is very much as a possibility, quite a substitute for a big drop in births, a possibility for the future, not something we're anticipating at this moment. Will there be increased demand for workers in the face of the aging in general? But how about the aging infrastructure in our country? We have massive aging infrastructure. Talking to somebody at the Department of Labor yesterday, he says, why don't we have bullet trains? How about also needs to address climate change? Might we start hiring a lot of people to build solar cells and wind turbines? There are real opportunities here. Will innovations to greatly increase labor productivity, as I think Nicole was alluding to, will those help? And the question is, will they help or hurt demand for labor? If we have much more productivity, will employers respond by saying we don't need to hire as many people? Or will there always be things our society can benefit by having more people in work? So finally, I guess the question is, if we don't make real progress in these areas, we will need increase in taxes or lower scheduled benefits for Social Security, or some combination of these two, as in most past major legislation. So again, the impetus here, the desire, the hope was to see how much of the shortfalls in the future that are resulting from the dramatic change in the age distribution of the population we might be able to address by having increased demand for labor. It looks like there's a possibility for some, especially as I forget whether it was Nicole or Julie mentioned, there's a further untapped resource for 65 and older that is going to have an increasing average age. But on the other hand, with modification of the nature of work, we should be able to keep a lot of those people at work longer, and that could benefit our society. So lots of possibilities, and also Jim just trying to bring this back a little bit into the Social Security realm here too.
Steve, just to run for a second with what you've just said, I think as the group thinks about these issues, right, the automation question, what's the AI impact on the labor market, the shift for labor intensive service demanded by high income workers, and the implications of changing income distribution for level of earnings of employment demand. I mean, these are all issues that you and Nicole have touched on here. And I think that was some of what we hope to get out onto the table as the group is thinking about this, to just recognize that this is not just a mechanical calculation, as it were, of let's look back and look forward. It is a crystal ball calculation, but hopefully there are some things which a group like this and other groups that are meeting here at the Royal Sonesta today can potentially address and think about.